Thank you, everybody, for being here and during this really sunny afternoon to be on this side of the curtains, on the dark side, sharing this time for this presentation. I'd like to talk about several ongoing projects that I have and several of my interest on large-scale urbanization processes and their impacts on social life and life in general, more than human life as well. So that's why this question of the peri-urban and its relation to infrastructure provision and how infrastructure currently doesn't really work for life, the maintenance of life and care, and how it could perhaps be repurposed. That's the general idea of the talk. I'd like to first take a few minutes to introduce you my perspective on large-scale urbanization processes, the urbanization of the world, and to discuss the multiple dimensions of what it means to live in an urban world today. As I said, my analytical focus for this perspective is infrastructure provision, and in particular large-scale infrastructure networks, infrastructure that connects cities internally and externally, particularly questions of roads. The third aspect of this talk is the socio-environmental dimension of this process and how this mode of development that I've identified, that with colleagues we've termed infrastructure-led development, and its extractivist characteristic, how it has major implications for socio-environmental development in both urban and peri-urban areas. What I mean is more consolidated cities as well as emerging urban environments. So finally, in this presentation, I'd like to reflect a little bit on this idea of how to think about infrastructure otherwise, not just in terms of its functional economic development purposes, the terms in which infrastructure is usually defined, but also in terms of questions of life and care more broadly. So, when I started working on the urbanization of the world, this is a time with colleagues such as Neil Brenner and Christian Schmidt started talking about planetary urbanization, and some of the people I worked with back in the US started joking to me, say, oh, well, you're looking now at different planets and Star Wars. And I always thought about that, and I thought that at some point I would like to write about and clarify that confusion. Recently, a couple of years ago, you may know in popular culture, the Star Wars series of Disney Plus, now the streaming series, the Mandalorian specifically, show this capital of the Republic, this so-called city planet, Coruscant. And I thought discussing Coruscant would be a good opportunity to clarify what we mean by planetary urbanization and planet Earth. When we talk about living in an urbanized planet, we do not mean that Earth is fully urbanized and everybody on this planet live on city-like conditions. What we mean is that cities are at the center of world development today, and that the socio-environmental impacts of urban living are felt everywhere in all kinds of environments, even environments that appear on surface purely natural, such as, for example, the oceans, high mountains, and even the atmosphere. So that's what I wanted to talk about in that short piece on the conversation, and how this notion of the planet city, which is actually an academic notion from the 1960s. There was this architect planner from Greece living in the United States, Konstantinos Doxiadis, who coined this term, ecumenopolis, the planet city in Greek. And how, in fact, our planet could never sustain that kind of urban development. Still, we're kind of moving towards that in very concerning, dangerous ways. And I'm going to explain about that in a second. So we can talk about planetary urbanization as not just a hyperbolic metaphor, but a useful perspective to understand how globalized capitalism is shaping contemporary urbanization processes and what impacts this has beyond the economy. About 20 years ago, in the early 20th century, the United Nations started talking about a demographic transition. They were talking about this momentous transition in when more than half of all living humans were living in cities or human settlements and not in rural or isolated parts of the planet. So this was around 2004. The United Nations Population Division started issuing those reports that emphasize this aspect, the majority of human beings living in cities or urban settlements. This is just one dimension of the process. It's just perhaps the demographic evidence, but the process is much more multidimensional and complex. Geographer Karen Seto from Yale has shown the physical transformation of cities and how actually urbanized areas, using satellite data, for example, how urbanized areas, their extent has expanded more broadly, faster than the demographic growth, actually. So urban cores worldwide, they still occupy a relatively small percentage of the Earth's surface, but they're expanding, and they're expanding faster than the demographic growth. In addition to that kind of more evident expansion of cities, both demographic and physical, what we have is more extensive and deeper urban impacts on other kinds of environments. Evidence of this is presented, for example, in the unprecedented extension of roads and transport surface in the 21st century. The extent of roads has multiplied, particularly in middle-income countries. I've looked at this in Brazil. I have colleagues such as Nitin Batla at ETH in Switzerland who looks at this in India. But we have more roads, more extensive reach of roads everywhere on the planet, particularly in middle-income countries. Interestingly enough, in the early 20th century, around 2008, I believe the World Bank started collecting data on roads worldwide. And if you look at the database, there's very interesting evidence of the growth of the extension of roads and reach of roads, especially, as I said, in middle-income countries and formerly erstwhile remote areas of these countries that have now been brought to the fold of large-scale development processes. They're not necessarily fully urbanized, but they're more in touch with the urban centers, both in their countries and internationally. They are much more impacted by urban changes. There are many more circulations, flows between these areas and urban centers. I mentioned Brenner Schmidt. There's also another colleague who works particularly with Neil Brenner, Nikos Katsikis, who talk about these environments. And they're not city-like environments, but they're intimately related to urban development. They call these environments operative landscapes, spaces where urbanization has its effects, spaces on which large-scale urbanization depends. For example, places of extraction, both agricultural and mining or other kinds of primary products that city development depends on. So these operative landscapes have grown in size and extension in the 21st century as well. Finally, when we have these operative landscapes extending, we have economic growth, we have people moving in, we have forms of urbanization that are emergent and unrecognized. That's what I call the peri-urban question. When we have forms of urbanization, if nascent, if still quite hybrid, where the urban and the rural confound each other, but that are nevertheless in a trajectory of growth with increasing population, with increasing economic functions, but an unrecognized urban characteristic and an underserved urban characteristic. So when we have people moving in and we have people settling, these spaces start developing certain urban characteristics, and more importantly, I think for aspects of collective action and policy, urban needs. Recognizing a place as urban starts producing, supporting that kind of development. These places need more than roads. These places need facilities for social reproduction, if you will. They need other forms of infrastructure that will not only serve the economy, but also serve the human development and needs of the people living there presently. So, in addition to all of these dimensions of planetary urbanization, we have the environmental dimension, both at local levels as well as global levels. I'm in Sweden now, so I thought of talking about the planetary boundaries and these ideas from the Stockholm Resilience Center, these 9 planetary boundaries that as humanity we have trespassed, and how, according to this evidence, we're now in what is called the unsafe operating space for humanity. Okay, much more more unsettled climate, more, in a way, dangerous environmental conditions for humanity in terms of availability of resources and in terms of multiple dimensions of what human needs need. So we have that global environmental perspective to the urbanization of the planet as well. So I work at this large scale, with this large scale perspective, but my work is very much situated in Latin America. I've done mostly field work in Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, and now Chile. The dynamics that I looked at there are, in a way, quite region-specific, place-specific, but they're also comparable to other places, particularly growing low and middle-income economies. What we see is these very large extensions, population growth at the urban core, yes, but also very large extensions, and the social production of new peri-urban spaces of uncertainty and precarity in various environments. What you see in these images here, on the top right of the screen, it's a state penitentiary, a jail built, that the state of Amazonas built a few dozen kilometers from the city of Manaus, cutting off a patch of the Amazon rainforest around it, a very, in a way, self-contained, isolated facility that it was for the state, was, I guess, more cost-effective to build in the outskirts of the city rather than the city itself. On the left, the portrait is in the northern part of Chile, highly extractive region of the country, historically a place that provides copper to world markets, now also rare earth minerals and lithium for electronic devices. And you can see here a settlement in this area, in this very arid area, with basically very limited infrastructure beyond the basic kind of road. You see the main road in the background and a more local road here in the front. There is electricity, yes, but for those of you working with urban design, this image shows something very far from what planners in the global north would call a complete street. Lots of facilities and amenities missing. So we see this vast extension of morphological hybridity in these new emerging urban locations. We have roads everywhere, connective infrastructure, but very selectively designed. And what we have is major forms of social and environmental precarity in these areas, okay, as well as very hybrid juxtaposition. The third image is not in Latin America, it's in Southeast Asia, so very contrastive juxtapositions of advanced technology, state-of-the-art infrastructure such as high-speed trains, combined with traditional forms of life, different kinds of ways of living that are being, in a way, somehow transformed and impacted by these extensions of the urban. So, let's talk a little bit about these extensions of roads everywhere and the mechanisms that support it. What I have called, together with Seth Schindler, infrastructure-led development. What is infrastructure-led development in the 21st century? It's a global project. It's a project that actually has international global scope. It's an economic project. It emerged in 2008, a time of economic crisis and recession. Its initial goal was to regain growth in the global north after the recession, but it has since continued. And what it has now been defined as is a project to close the global infrastructure investment gap. Basically address the world's so-called infrastructure deficit. There are many governmental actors as well as private actors involved in this. One of the private actors behind this is the World Economic Forum, that international elite organization based in Davos, Switzerland. Something quite interesting is that the World Economic Forum, you know that in one of their signature World Economic Competitiveness ranking, that they rank name and shame countries in terms of their economic competitiveness. They've adapted that index more than a decade ago to include infrastructure provision. In the past, their ranking was only about markets and policies. Now, their ranking also includes a column, a component, a dimension on infrastructure availability. So the World Economic Forum considers infrastructure key as to categorize a country's competitiveness. So you see this rise of interest on infrastructure among key players in global governance. As I said before, this accelerated after the 2008 recession, but actually, the region of the world that I'm interested in, Latin America, started a bit earlier, started about a decade earlier, led by the Brazilian government. At the time, the Fernando Henrique Cardoso administration, an administration that for almost a decade had invested heavily on roads and other kinds of infrastructure domestically in Brazil. And since 1999, the Cardoso administration spearheaded investment in infrastructure in other countries, in bordering countries, with a continental scope, and the very ambitious objective of linking the South American landmass by cross-border road networks. So, this initiative was called IRSA, the Initiative to Integrate Regional Infrastructure in South America. It had a very clear neoliberal export-oriented objective. It was to integrate markets physically so that their different commodities could be more easily exported to world markets. So it was not a country-based or a region-based project. It was a world-leaning project. It was for free markets, it was to promote exports, particularly of commodities, particularly the primary sector. So the objective, even though it had major government participation, this is a factor that sometimes people don't understand, that yes, there was large governmental funds involved, although also private funds and private actors, but this was aiming for free markets and world integration, basically reducing the cost and making logistics more reliable from South America to the world. So rather than regional integration, the objective of this project was intra-regional specialization based on commodities, making sure that different commodities from different regions of South America could reach the region's ports more cheaply, faster, and more reliably. Whilst most of these investments were placed in so-called backward or remote regions of these countries, therefore balancing the country developments, they also affected their main cities and regions because, as I said, what these infrastructures were doing was connecting these regions more to the export locations, where the ports are, where the largest, wealthier cities are located. So these roads spearheaded new forms of urban and regional growth, both in the remote regions where they were placed, but also on the coast. So there was economic development that came with it, but with very clear inequalities and unmet basic needs, let alone very unsustainable ways of development based on commodity exports. This is the origin of much peri-urban growth in Latin America in the 21st century. That's what my argument is, that peri-urban growth is not only occurring around the largest cities, but because of these extensions of roadway development in even more remote areas where we have this kind of transition and now peri-urban condition, more generalized peri-urban condition. So, looking at the international level and what has happened beyond South America. You may remember, many of you are quite young, you maybe don't remember how critical 2008 was, the subprime mortgage loan crisis in the US, and how it expanded internationally, all these contagion effects. Perhaps most closely here, you may have heard of the effects that this crisis had on Iceland, an economy that was very stable until then and got quite destabilized because of that crisis. That was one of the cyclical crises of globalized capitalism, not the first nor the last. We may be in the middle of another one now. We may have just gone through the COVID crisis just 5 years ago. And all of this have very important effects on territorial development, on cities and regions, through these questions of their impacts on investments and the infrastructure that is built. So my argument in terms of international left development is that this crisis accelerated the extractive approach to territorial development and infrastructure provision in the 21st century. It has many implications for this. One of them is that for those of you listening to the news now and all of this trade disputes, the incoming trade war between the US and China, and Trump changing his statements about how much tax the Chinese should pay, or Chinese imports should be paid by American importers, more accurately. This started in 2008. We have the beginning of the end to globalism with the 2008 crisis. The rise of Trump is just one symptom of that. The country where I live, the UK, Brexit is another symptom. A British historian, Neil Ferguson, in 2009, wrote about the collapse of Chimerica, the strategic alliance that in the 21st century link the world's now two largest economy, that of the United States and the People's Republic of China. A strategic alliance based on surplus exports from China to the US with also reinvestments in the US. The Chinese having trade surpluses, but the US allowing that because the Chinese would reinvest those surpluses in, for example, US Treasury bonds, but also more concrete investments in the country. When this strategic alliance starts to corrode, we now have investments that don't find a place to be invested in. We have funds, capital that doesn't find a place to invest it in. Marxist scholars talk about this as an overaccumulation crisis, for example. What is the solution that is devised at the time is that this capital be placed in investments in infrastructure in low and middle income countries. There is one economist, particularly Justin E. Fu-Ling, at the time head economist of the World Bank, who comes up with this idea, which is at the time marketed as a global Green New Deal or a new Marshall Plan for the 21st century, in which these investments could be effectively placed in infrastructure systems of low and middle income countries. This approach was seen as a way of overcoming the global recession. Justin E. Fu-Ling was not alone in this perspective. Actually, this was becoming a new kind of common sense among economists. It's called the New Structural Economics or Economic Geography. You may have heard about Paul Krugman, another economist proponent of this. And in 2008, directing excellent capital from the world's largest economies, not just the global north, the US, Europe, but also the global east, China in particular, to countries in the global south was seen as a win-win strategy. And infrastructure was seen as a key sector to do this. That's why our argument is that this new structural economics is not a break with the neoliberalism of earlier decades, but it's an evolution, a transformation, an adaptation. It brings the state, but to serve the similar goal that before was placed on markets alone. The goal is world economic integration, led by markets. So we pass from deregulation in the 1980 crisis to good governance in the 1990s, institutions, rules in the 1990s. And in the 21st century, we have this focus on functional territories. How do you make territories functional? How do you integrate it seamlessly economically? Through infrastructure. You build roads that connect economies. You upgrade ports. You increase their capacity. You make transshipment cheaper. That's our argument. Why there is this rush to invest in infrastructures, why roads are expanding, why there is more capacity being built in terms of connective infrastructures. So as I said, this was called the Global Marshall Plan at the time in 2008, or in the years soon after 2008. And the objective was to help Global South economies to grow, but linking that growth to sustaining aggregate demand in the Global North economies that were in the midst of a recession. Infrastructure was identified as a key sector because of historical infrastructure deficits, or so-called bottlenecks. The case of Brazil, there's much discussed the so-called Brazilian cost, the cost of moving goods domestically, the time that took to move exports from the areas of the countries where it was cheap to produce them to the coastal ports. However, doing this is not simple. Infrastructure is known to be a very tricky investment. for private investors. It takes a very long time to recover it. It's costly to maintain, and there's a lot of uncertainty regarding infrastructure as an investment class. Hence, the participation of states and global governance institutions to coordinate investments and making sure that this investment class would become more attractive to private investors. Not perhaps individual investor, but much more the kind of institutional investors, risk averse. So one of the proposals at the time was to create a global structural transformation fund to support green growth through investments in bottleneck releasing transformative infrastructure projects in both advanced and developing countries. This is already back to 2013. This didn't quite work as intended. There were some funds that were created, there were some institutions that were founded to support and coordinate these investments, but the world is still very much, according to the sectors, in a major deficit of infrastructure. In fact, the G20, one of the institutions of global governance that got really behind this idea, predicts a shortfall of 15 trillion US dollar shortfall in infrastructure by 2040. That is the difference between the investment that they predict is needed and the investment that they predict that will be realized. A major part of this sum comes from deficits in road investments, surface transport investments. Another institution that got really behind this is the World Bank, as I was saying, particularly an initiative that was called From Billions to Trillions to accelerate increment investments into low and middle income countries for their infrastructure. This was promoted at a conference in Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, basically looking for ways to implement ways to secure private investment, the profitability of private investment in infrastructure projects in low and middle income countries. As this was happening in the international multilateral system of development, we have the rise of a new actor at the global level. We have the People's Republic of China emerging as a global donor and financer, particularly of infrastructure projects. We have the rise, some scholars call it the rise of global China, the rise of China's role in global infrastructure financings, particularly. There's one initiative now more than 10 years old by then the new Chinese Premier Xi Jinping, the Belt and Road Initiative. An initiative to support the building of both surface connections, a belt that would link the Eurasian landmass, and maritime connections, recreating the maritime connections of the Silk Road. That's why this initiative is now known as the Belt Road Initiative. Okay, so investing in roadway, railway connections, linking the Eurasian landmass, as well as investing in ports, not only in China, but also Southeast Asia, South Asia, particularly places that could be quite receptive to this Chinese investment, such as the time Sri Lanka, places in East Africa as well, and as well as places in Southern Europe. You may know that the Greek port of Piraeus now has a duplicate port that is completely private and completely financed by Chinese investors. So we have this very large scheme now that in a way can operate much faster and that has mobilized much more capital than the previous initiatives that I talked about in terms of building infrastructure connecting places. This map just show you the initial plans of the Belt and Road Initiative, and now we have many associate countries to the Belt and Road Initiative, even if they're not within this immediate area of influence, including South American countries. You may have heard about this large-scale port that was just opened in Peru, also with Chinese investment. Brazil is an associate of this BRI. China is now the main trading partner globally of Brazil. We have major Chinese investments as well in South and Central America. So we have, in a way, these initial plans developed by the US-led multilateral system being materialized much faster and more extensively by the more bilateral model of development coming from the PRC. So we have this growth in infrastructure investments in low and middle income country, but also have new questions of resource and land grabs. We see an interlinking between these infrastructure investments and resource and land grabs. That's why in an earlier paper with Seth, we talked about the scramble for infrastructure. A race between the world's largest economies to invest in infrastructure, but also linked to their interests in raw materials and land. In the 2008, you may remember some of the price instability that was with very basic commodities such as rice worldwide, and how there was a major race worldwide to secure that resource. We see land grabs, water grabs, major investments in primary sectors in low and middle income countries. Talking about Latin America, this was even more clear in African economies. We see these infrastructure investments interwoven with resource and land grabs, with major impacts, particularly in erstwhile remote regions where we see new form of extractivism arising and becoming profitable. They become more profitable because now the cost of logistics is lower and it's easier to move all of these resources from their sites to being exported. So what we see is networks of transport, energy, and telecommunications infrastructure that are enabling this large-scale extractive operations. So this is what took us to define this mode of development as infrastructure-led development, spearheaded by a global growth coalition that re-centralized urban and regional planning. A lot of the actors involved here are not local government. They are ministries. They're national level governments or supranational organizations. Many of these are treaties that, in a way, countries become obliged to comply with, and therefore are buffered from democratic scrutiny of voters in each country, because they become international obligations of different countries. That's the case of East and South America, for example. We have now more focus on territorial planning coming from ministries of economics, the economy ministries, rather than the older actors focusing on territorial development. We have much more focus on territorial development as a matter of economic investment in infrastructure. What's the goal? Again, to develop transnational territories that can be stitched together with large-scale infrastructure, spaces of seamless movement of goods. Something very interesting is that the plans that are being hatched at this time sound very retro. They're actually reminiscent of regional planning strategies and ideas that were very popular in the 1960s. In the development period, we start hearing about corridors again. We start hearing about growth poles. We start thinking about all these kinds of strategies, spatial planning strategies that neoliberalism had rendered obsolete, but now are being repurposed to serve neoliberal objectives of world economic integration. This is how, in a way, the 2008 change the orthodoxy of economic development. Now we need planning to be able to provide infrastructure that otherwise the market would not provide. That's why we talk about infrastructure-led development as the goal of getting the territory right. Not just prices and institutions, but also functional territories, seamlessly integrated to global value chains and being able to be part of the geo-economic competition happening in the world right now, not just geopolitical, but also geo-economic competition. So this notion of territories developing based on their access to global value chains, their ability to export, contribute raw materials to this global scale value chains. As I said, this is happening from two sides: the US-led multilateral system, what is now called infrastructure for development, model that international financial institutions such as the G20, the Organization for Economic Development, support. I talk about the World Economic Forum as an institution purely led by private actors. There's also the United Nations, particularly through the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals, you know, they try to do everything right in 15 years, but the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly in terms of a sustainable economy, they talk about the need for infrastructure. They talk about infrastructure bottlenecks. So much of this approach now is focused on de-risking, taking risk away from investments in infrastructure, making infrastructure more appealing as an investment class to bring more private investment. As I said, so far with mixed results. On the other side, we have the PRC, the People's Republic of China, bilateral model of lending that has advanced much faster, more expeditively, more expedient, but very much focusing on what we can call China-centric world connectivity. As a result of this model, we have places more interconnected, but there's almost two systems working in parallel. It's very interesting if you look at world maps and countries who have the PRC as the main trading partners and countries that have the US as their main trading partner. It's interesting how Brazil has shifted from one to the other. It's interesting how this is playing out in domestic politics in the US right now. But it's also, we see numerous tensions going on around the world, for example, in the South China Sea, in terms of this kind of geoeconomic competition, dangerously edging towards geopolitical and military competition at the moment. You may think, what is he talking about all of this in the course for urban development, right? Why does this matter for cities in the global south? Why is this of relevance for urbanization in low and middle income economies? It's because we need to understand the interconnectivity of things and how regional development and urbanization are not two separate spheres, they're mutually linked. These infrastructural spaces are new landscapes with novel kinds of urbanization dynamics emerging. Elia Apostolopoulou and other colleagues have written a very convincing explanation of this and how the BRI, in particular the Belt and Road Initiative, has inscribed new purpose and connections between urban regions and restructured existing towns and cities alongside the construction of entirely new built environments, remaking the urban fabric, a Lefebvrean term, very much inspiring extended urbanization discussions, and reshaping social geographies, including local global inequalities at a historically unparalleled transcontinental scale. So cities and their development paths are not independent from this dynamics. They're very much embedded into this dynamics, being reshaped by this investment. Even though the brunt of this investment has gone to regions that are quite far away from the metropolitan cores of different countries, they connect them to the metropolitan cores, generate new flows, dynamics, growth patterns. This is why we need to consider this kind of integrated infrastructure planetary geography to the growth of cities and their development and reshaping. There's multiple questions about beyond that kind of tension between the US and China in terms of how this model of infrastructure can be sustainable long term. One important question for me is, what will this mean in terms of net zero and the goal of containing greenhouse gas emissions? If you read not just the SDG, but many of the other policy documents, they believe that these are mutually consistent goals, that we can have more roads and surface connectivity, trade integration, and less emissions. To me, this sounds, I'm not quite convinced that this can happen, that we can achieve net zero while increasing trade movement of goods and more roads. But beyond this global question, we have localized impacts of these investments in infrastructure, particularly in the environmentally sensitive areas where they're being placed. Questions of impacts on wildlife, but also broader questions of environmental decay in these areas now being exposed to the extension of large-scale extractive activities. There's a lot we could discuss about the impacts in these areas. But back to the urban question. Also, we know that we live in a much more unstable world. I talk about the unsafe operating space now because we're past those several of those 9 planetary boundaries that Stockholm Resilience Institute talks about. So, what do these infrastructures mean for urban resilience? Interestingly, in this process of promoting infrastructure investment and improving infrastructure, there is this idea of building quality infrastructure. Quality infrastructure, a notion coming originally from Japan, basically looks at infrastructure that is robust and resilient to natural disaster, infrastructure that can withstand natural shocks, infrastructure that in a way can be maintained or rebuilt easily even when we have extreme events happening, such as, for example, flooding. When we look at the design of this infrastructure, it's quite questionable how resilient the infrastructures can be. But the big question for me is how making the infrastructure more resilient make the surrounding area, the people living near there, the cities, more or less resilient. What happens when we raise rail berths, for example, when we fence these prime infrastructures? What happens with the areas surrounding them? Do they become actually more prone to be flooded and to be impacted by these natural disasters? And this is a question that we can ask in many different countries in terms of that infrastructure that is being built. A lot of this is happening in highly floodable areas. I talked about Southeast Asia before. There's a lot of water management, flood disaster risk prevention mega projects being built in Indonesia right now with very questionable impacts beyond the zone, the very narrow zone that's defined as to be protected. Okay, so this is a very important question to ask about those infrastructure projects. Okay, so what can be done about these risks now that infrastructure-led development faces, and this idea of resilience and the sustainability imperative? I'm working with colleagues in the UK, as well as in Brazil and China, the Federal University of Minas Gerais, Chinese University of Hong Kong, and different planning approaches that are being taken worldwide to improve the sustainability of this urban planet in their different countries. We decided to focus on what we're calling zoning for sustainability and the emergence of large-scale special purpose sustainability zones. These are special zones, but no longer special economic zones, such as those that China used since the 1980s to foster economic development. You may know the the story of Shenzhen as a very successful case of these special economic zones. These are sustainability zones, okay? And they take different forms with different regulations. What they have in common is that they focus on a zone, on specific territory to be applied at, and it applies exceptional regulations to these areas. In the UK, we have clear air zones, ultra-low emission zones, also cold zones, where emissions, particularly car emissions, need to be constrained, and people are taxed and fares are charged to meet this objective. We also have nature recovery zones, biodiversity corridors, green belts, another planning, old school planning instrument now being refloated and extended. We have conservation and disaster prevention zones, urban buffers, zones where green buildings are being promoted. I know there's a zone here in Malmö I'd love to visit, where low emissions, sustainable energy use, and so on are being promoted, also through tax codes and so on. Most recently, we have the 15-minute city idea, this specific zone where high density mixed uses and compact development is promoted. So it's quite interesting how in this urban fabric, world extended urban fabric, we have these very large zones now that are being devised to try to manage its effects. But questions that we're being asked, perhaps in 1 or 2 years, if I come back, I can tell you more of what we're finding, is how transformative these zones can be and what is their objective. Is their objective to effect a global transformation, or is their objective actually quite conservative? Is their goal to maintain things as they are, a kind of weak form of sustainability? To borrow from Stephanie Wakefield's work on Miami and the parts that are being built so that the strategic parts of the cities don't sink in rising sea level and are maintained. And we also need to think about what happens outside the zone. What are the impacts, not only in the zone, not only in the areas that are being preserved, protected, but what happens outside the zone, particularly in the areas that are immediately outside the zone. Are we finding new forms of urban bias? This is one of my critiques of a lot of the C40 plans. Are we finding, we were talking earlier this morning, we didn't get to talk about it much, but a new form of sacrifice zones that are being emerged, that areas that are not being protected, or that in a way are becoming green sacrifice zones. What happens when an area becomes a very extensive green belt? What happens to the people who used to live there? Colleagues in Beijing are looking at this now. Beijing has a very extensive green belt. So what kind of displacement is happening around that green belt and inside the green belt? So finally, I'm almost at 1 hour. Thinking about infrastructure otherwise, how can we think about infrastructure otherwise when we have this very large scale dynamics going on with this very powerful actors at the state level and corporate economic might level? One perspective that can help is not just focusing on the economy and economic development, looking at human development and the needs, the multiple needs for infrastructures of care that human development requires. When we focus on care, we start recognizing questions of intersectionality of needs, intersectional needs based on people's embodiments, their age, their gender, where they live, this kind of hybrid areas, urban, rural, but also start understanding interdependencies of life and how care is essential for maintaining life, not just human life, but as I was saying before, more than human life. How a focus on care helps pursue deeper forms of sustainability. As I was saying before, for peri-urban conditions, we perhaps need to change the way we think about where these infrastructures are placed, how they are sited, what is their area of influence when these services that need to be provided really focus on populations that are much more dispersed and live at much lower density conditions. For this, it's essential to be able to mobilize the state. I didn't say state-led, but it needs to be at least state-mediated. We do need the resources of the state to be able to achieve these kinds of infrastructure provision. It's a very large scale. But how do we get there? An approach can be focusing on subaltern initiated forms of infrastructure development. What Leon Tellez Contreras, former colleague at Sheffield, he's a Mexican national, Claudia, you may know him, has published a very interesting review in Urban Studies about these forms of popular infrastructure, what can be called infra-making and infra-commoning from below, basically popular infrastructure from below, and looking at alternatives to development and looking at repair as an essential alternative to development, working what already exists and repair it rather than focusing on new development. Broader questions of repair, such as repairing the environment. Also, be inspired by the anticipatory possibilities of subaltern initiated infrastructure, being able to take them to scale. But then again, we need that mediation of the state. So that's my talk for today. Hopefully, maybe it was a lot of ground here, but what I wanted to emphasize is that we live in an age of extended urbanization at the planetary scale, with infrastructure underpinning it and infrastructure being built to serve a model of global development, economic global development, with major problems of not only exclusion, but also unsustainable growth, particularly in peri-urban spaces that are not recognized as such, with major inequalities and exclusions. In these peri-urban areas, it is essential to be able to start developing aspects, infrastructures of care. I recently worked with a colleague in Argentina on a plan, analyzing a plan, a national development plan. It was called Plan Argentina Grande, the Great Argentina Plan, which had very interesting ideas of infrastructures cares linked to investments in roadways. Unfortunately, it was a plan that was issued just 3 months before the government was voted out, and a highly now very right-wing regime was put in place, and obviously this plan is not being implemented. But it was quite interesting that actually these notions of care and at least an attempt to integrate it in public works was made to that plan. So we can say that these notions of care are beginning to seep into public policy discourse, if not yet fully implemented. We're talking about Colombia, the state level, the Valle de Cauca, departmental level, there's also infrastructures of care being planned. So it's actually quite interesting how this is emergent, and how this can be an alternative, a truly sustainable alternative to the resilience imperative that is not really transforming this connectivity imperative and is focused on roads, but it actually follows similar logics of profits. And it's actually a secondary complementary role to make sure the roads and their profitability function continues operating even in an unsafer planet. So we need to shift really from such forms of self-sustainability to deeper approaches to protecting life and repairing the planet.